thought I knew what evil looked like. I thought it would be obvious, threatening, something you could spot from a mile away. But evil, I learned, often comes disguised as kindness. It brings you homemade cookies, fixes your broken fence, and offers to help carry your groceries. For 3 years I trusted my neighbor Tom completely. He was the perfect neighbor, the kind of man who restored my faith in humanity after my husband's death left me feeling vulnerable and alone. But when I discovered what he was really hiding in that garage of his, I realized I had been living next door to a monster. And the worst part? I had invited him into my home, into my life, and almost into the lives of innocent children who had no idea how close they'd come to unimaginable horror. The moving truck pulled away from 1247 Maple Street on a crisp September morning 3 years ago, leaving behind a modest 2-story house with blue shutters and a well-maintained garden. I watched from my kitchen window as a tall, lean man in his early 50s stepped out of a silver Honda Civic, surveying his new property with the careful eye of someone who appreciated order and detail. I'd been living alone in my house at 1245 Maple Street for 8 months by then, ever since my husband James had passed away from cancer. The silence in my home had become deafening, and I found myself looking forward to having a neighbor again. The previous owners, the Hendersons, had been an elderly couple who kept to themselves, and their house had sat empty for 6 months after they moved to a retirement community in Florida. That afternoon, I decided to be neighborly and baked a batch of chocolate chip cookies to welcome the new resident. I'd always been the type of person who believed in community and looking out for one another. James used to tease me about my tendency to mother everyone in the neighborhood, but it was just who I was. I knocked on his front door around 4 o'clock, holding a plate of warm cookies covered with aluminum foil. When the door opened, I was greeted by a man with kind brown eyes, graying hair, and a genuine smile that immediately put me at ease. "You must be my new neighbor," he said, his voice warm and welcoming. "I'm Tom Bradley." "I'm Margaret Chin," I replied, offering him the cookies. "I live right next door. I thought you might be hungry after all that moving." Tom's face lit up as he accepted the plate. "That's incredibly thoughtful of you, Margaret. I was just thinking about what to do for dinner, and these smell absolutely amazing." We chatted for a few minutes on his front porch, and I learned that Tom was recently divorced, worked in IT consulting, and had moved to Denver from Phoenix for a fresh start. He seemed genuinely interested in the neighborhood, asking about local shops, the best places to eat, and whether there were any community events he should know about. "I really appreciate having such a welcoming neighbor," Tom said as our conversation wound down. "If there's ever anything you need help with, please don't hesitate to ask. I know it can't be easy managing a house on your own." I was touched by his consideration. Most people avoided mentioning my widowhood, but Tom acknowledged it without making me feel pitted or fragile. Over the following weeks, Tom proved to be everything he'd promised and more. When my garbage disposal broke, he came over with his toolbox and had it working again within an hour. When a storm knocked down a large branch in my backyard, Tom appeared the next morning with a chainsaw and spent his Saturday cutting it up and hauling it away. "You really don't have to do all this," I protested as he loaded the last of the wood into his truck. "It's no trouble at all," Tom insisted, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Besides, what are neighbors for?" Tom had a way of anticipating needs I didn't even know I had. He noticed when my front porch light burned out and replaced it without being asked. He saw me struggling with heavy grocery bags one afternoon and immediately came over to help carry them inside. When winter arrived and I was dreading the thought of shoveling my driveway, I'd wake up to find it already cleared, with Tom's footprints leading back to his own property. "You're spoiling me," I told him one December morning, finding him spreading rock salt on my walkway. "My mother raised me to look out for people," he replied with that same warm smile. "She always said that taking care of your neighbors was just part of being a decent human being." I began to think of Tom as the brother I'd never had. He was respectful of my space, never overstaying his welcome, but always available when I needed help. During the long, lonely evenings of my first winter without James, Tom's presence next door was a comfort. I could see the warm glow of his lights through my bedroom window, and it made me feel less alone in the world. Tom seemed to have a similar routine to mine. He left for work around 8 in the morning, usually returning by 6 in the evening. On weekends, he worked in his garden, washed his car, and maintained his property with the same meticulous care he showed mine. He was quiet, considerate, and exactly the kind of neighbor anyone would want. The only thing that struck me as slightly odd was how private Tom was about his personal life. In all our conversations, he rarely mentioned friends, family, or social activities. When I invited him to join me for dinner or suggested we attend a neighborhood barbecue together, he always politely declined, saying he preferred to keep to himself. "I'm still adjusting to the divorce," he explained when I pressed him gently about his social isolation. "I'm just not ready to be around a lot of people yet." I understood completely. Grief and major life changes affected everyone differently, and I respected his need for solitude. Tom's garage was attached to his house but had a separate entrance facing the street. It was always kept closed, and I noticed that Tom was very particular about it. He would pull his car into the driveway, quickly open the garage door with a remote, drive inside, and immediately close it again. I never saw him working on projects in there or using it for storage like most people did with their garages. "Do you have a workshop in there?" I asked him once, making casual conversation as he helped me plant some new flowers in my front garden. Tom's hands stilled for just a moment before he continued digging. "Just storage mostly. I'm not much of a handyman despite appearances." It was a perfectly reasonable answer, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, like he'd prepared for that question. As winter turned to spring, I began to notice small changes in Tom's behavior. He seemed more distracted during our conversations, often glancing toward his house as if he was anxious to get back inside. He started declining my offers of help with his yard work, saying he preferred to handle it himself. One evening in late March, I was having trouble sleeping and decided to make myself some chamomile tea. As I stood in my kitchen waiting for the water to boil, I noticed a light on in Tom's garage. It was nearly midnight, which seemed like an odd time for him to be working on anything. I watched for a few minutes, curious about what he might be doing so late. The light stayed on for about an hour before going dark again. I thought it was strange but not necessarily alarming. Maybe he couldn't sleep either and had decided to organize some storage boxes. But over the next few weeks I began to notice the pattern. 2 or 3 times a week, the garage light would come on sometime between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m., staying on for an hour or more before going dark again. I never heard any sounds of construction or repair work, which made it even more puzzling. My curiosity was further piqued when I started noticing unfamiliar cars parked in front of Tom's house during these late-night garage sessions. Different vehicles each time, a red sedan, a white SUV, a black pickup truck, always arriving after dark and leaving before dawn. I told myself I was being paranoid, that Tom was entitled to his privacy and his nocturnal habits were none of my business. But something about the secretive nature of these activities made me uncomfortable. The first real warning sign came on a Saturday afternoon in April. I was working in my garden when I heard Tom's voice from his backyard, talking to someone on his phone. His tone was different from the gentle, considerate way he usually spoke, sharper, more authoritative. "I told you the delivery needs to be made exactly as we discussed," I heard him say. "Any deviation from the plan and the whole operation is compromised." I froze, my hands still buried in the soil around my tomato plants. "Operation? What kind of operation?" "The merchandise needs to be handled very carefully," Tom continued, his voice carrying clearly over the fence between our properties. "One mistake and we're all in serious trouble." Merchandise? Tom had told me he worked in IT consulting, helping small businesses with their computer systems. What kind of merchandise would be involved in that line of work? I tried to convince myself that I was misunderstanding, that Tom was probably just talking about computer equipment or software. But the secretive tone of his voice and the emphasis on being careful made it sound like something much more serious. That evening, I found myself paying closer attention to Tom's activities. I noticed that he kept his curtains drawn more tightly than before, and when he did come outside, he seemed to scan the neighborhood carefully before proceeding with whatever he was doing. A few days later, I was taking out my trash when I saw Tom loading something into his car from the garage. He moved quickly and efficiently, but I caught a glimpse of what looked like a large, heavy box wrapped in black plastic. When he saw me watching, he quickly closed his trunk and gave me a wave that seemed forced. "Working late tonight?" I called out, trying to sound casual. "Just some equipment that needs to be delivered to a client," Tom replied, but he didn't meet my eyes. "You know how it is in the tech business, everything's always urgent." But as Tom drove away, I realized I'd never actually seen any evidence of his supposed IT consulting business. No business cards, no company vehicle, no clients coming to the house for meetings. For someone who claimed to work in technology, Tom seemed remarkably disconnected from the digital world. I began to pay more attention to the details of Tom's daily routine, and the inconsistencies started to add up. He claimed to work regular business hours, but I often saw his car in the driveway during times when he should have been at the office. When I mentioned seeing him home during the day, he always had an explanation: client meetings that were cancelled, work he could do from home, flexible scheduling. The explanations were always plausible, but there were so many of them that I started to wonder if any of them were true. One morning in early May, I was watering my plants when the mail carrier, Janet, stopped to chat. We'd known each other for years, and she often shared neighborhood gossip during her rounds. "Your neighbor Tom seems like a nice man," she said, nodding toward his house. "Very polite when I see him." "He's been wonderful," I agreed. "So helpful since James passed away." Janet lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Though I have to say he gets some unusual mail. Lots of packages from companies I've never heard of, always addressed to different names." My blood ran cold. Different names. Oh yes. Sometimes it's Tom Bradley, sometimes Thomas Bradley, sometimes T. Mitchell or T. Morrison. I figured maybe he uses different versions of his name for business purposes, but it's a bit odd. After Janet continued on her route, I stood in my garden trying to process what she told me. Why would Tom be receiving mail under different names? And why hadn't he mentioned that his full name was Thomas, not Tom? That night, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything. I kept thinking about the late-night garage activities, the mysterious phone conversations, the packages addressed to different names, and the general sense that Tom was not who he claimed to be. I decided to do something I'd never done before. I looked up Tom Bradley online. I searched for IT consultants named Tom Bradley in the Denver area and found nothing. I searched for Thomas Bradley and got several results, but none of them matched my neighbor's description or background. I tried searching for his supposed previous address in Phoenix, but couldn't find any record of a Tom or Thomas Bradley living there. It was as if my neighbor didn't exist in any official capacity. The more I searched, the more concerned I became. I found myself questioning everything Tom had told me about himself. If he wasn't really an IT consultant, what did he do for work? If he hadn't really lived in Phoenix, where had he come from? And most importantly, if he'd been lying about these basic facts, what else was he hiding? I barely slept that night, my mind racing with possibilities. By morning, I'd convinced myself that I was overreacting, that there were probably innocent explanations for everything. Maybe Tom was in witness protection, or maybe he was just a very private person who valued his anonymity. But as I was getting dressed, I heard voices in Tom's backyard again. I crept to my bedroom window and peered through the blinds, trying to see who was there. Tom was standing near his back door talking to a man I'd never seen before. The stranger was younger, maybe in his 30s, with dark hair and an aggressive posture that made me instinctively uncomfortable. "The timeline has been moved up," I heard the stranger say. "We need to make the next delivery by Friday." "That's not enough time," Tom replied, his voice tense. "The preparation process can't be rushed." "It has to be rushed. We've got buyers waiting and they're not patient people." "Buyers? What were they selling?" "If we move too fast, we risk exposure," Tom argued. "And if we get caught, we're all going to prison for a very long time." Prison. The word hit me like a physical blow. Whatever Tom was involved in, it was serious enough to warrant prison time. I watched as the two men continued their heated discussion, their voices occasionally rising loud enough for me to catch fragments of conversation. I heard mentions of merchandise, clients, security measures, and disposal methods. When the stranger finally left, Tom stood in his backyard for several minutes, running his hands through his hair in what looked like frustration or stress. Then he went into his garage and I saw the light come on even though it was broad daylight. I spent the rest of the day in a state of anxiety, jumping at every sound and constantly checking to see what Tom was doing. I felt like I was living next door to a stranger, someone who had been deceiving me for 3 years. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to find out what Tom was really hiding in that garage. I waited until after midnight when Tom's house was dark and the neighborhood was quiet. I put on dark clothes and crept out my back door, staying close to the fence line between our properties. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure the whole neighborhood could hear it. Tom's garage had a small window on the side facing my house, positioned about 6 feet off the ground. I'd never paid much attention to it before, but now it represented my only chance to see what was inside. I found an old milk crate in my shed and carried it as quietly as possible to the side of Tom's garage. Standing on the crate, I could just reach the window. It was dirty and had a curtain drawn across it, but there was a small gap at the bottom where I could see inside. What I saw made my blood freeze in my veins. The garage had been converted into some kind of workshop, but not the kind where someone fixed cars or built furniture. There were tables covered with electronic equipment, cameras, computers, and what looked like professional lighting. But it was what was on the walls that made me realize I was looking into the lair of a predator. Photographs. Dozens of them. Pictures of children, young children, some who looked like they couldn't be more than 8 or 9 years old. The photos appeared to have been taken without the children's knowledge, in parks, at schools, outside homes. I stumbled backward off the milk crate, my hand clamped over my mouth to keep from screaming. Tom wasn't just hiding some minor illegal activity. He was involved in something that targeted children. I ran back to my house as quietly as I could, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd seen. Tom, the man who had been so kind to me, who had helped me through the darkest period of my life, was a predator. And I had been living next door to him, completely unaware, for 3 years. But as I sat in my kitchen, shaking and trying to decide what to do, I realized that my nightmare was just beginning. Because if Tom discovered that I knew his secret, I might become his next victim. What would you do in this situation? Leave a comment with "Call police" if you think she should contact authorities immediately, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking neighbor stories. I spent the rest of that night pacing my living room, my mind racing with the horrifying implications of what I'd discovered. Every creak of the house made me jump. Every shadow outside my window looked like Tom coming to silence me. I kept the lights off and stayed away from the windows, terrified that he might realize I'd been spying on him. By dawn I'd made my decision. I had to call the police, but I needed to be smart about it. If Tom suspected that I knew about his activities, he might destroy evidence, or worse, he might try to hurt me to keep me quiet. I waited until I saw Tom leave for his supposed job that morning, then I drove to a police station across town rather than calling from my home phone. I didn't want to risk Tom overhearing anything or seeing police cars in front of my house. Detective Sarah Rodriguez listened to my story with growing concern, taking detailed notes as I described everything I'd observed over the past few months. "Mrs. Chin," she said when I finished, "what you're describing sounds like it could be part of a child exploitation operation. These are extremely dangerous people, and if your neighbor is involved, you could be in serious danger." "What should I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "First, you need to act completely normal around him. Don't let him suspect that you know anything. Second, we're going to need to conduct surveillance and gather evidence before we can make any arrests. Can you help us by documenting his activities?" Detective Rodriguez explained that they would need to build a solid case before moving in. She gave me a small camera and asked me to photograph anyone who came and went from Tom's house, along with any license plates I could capture. "Be extremely careful," she warned. "If he realizes you're watching him, your life could be in danger." I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, the weight of what I'd gotten myself into settling heavily on my shoulders. I wasn't just a concerned neighbor anymore. I was an undercover informant helping to investigate what might be a child predator ring. Over the next week, I documented everything I could while trying to maintain my normal routine with Tom. It was the most difficult acting job of my life, smiling and making small talk with a man I now knew was a monster. "You seem a bit tired lately, Margaret," Tom observed one morning as I was getting my mail. "Everything okay?" "Just haven't been sleeping well," I replied, forcing a smile. "You know how it is." "Maybe you should see a doctor about that," Tom suggested, his tone full of the same concern he'd always shown. Sleep problems can be a sign of other health issues. The fact that he could sound so caring while hiding such evil made my skin crawl, but I nodded and thanked him for his concern. That night, I photographed 3 different men arriving at Tom's house between midnight and 2 a.m. They all went directly to the garage, staying for about an hour each before leaving. I managed to get clear shots of their faces and license plates, which I passed along to Detective Rodriguez the next day. "You're doing great work, Mrs. Chin," she told me during our clandestine meeting at a coffee shop downtown. "We've run the plates, and 2 of these men have prior arrests for child exploitation crimes. We're building a strong case." But as the investigation continued, I began to notice changes in Tom's behavior that made me increasingly nervous. He seemed more alert, more suspicious, constantly scanning the neighborhood as if he sensed he was being watched. One evening I was in my kitchen when I saw Tom standing in his backyard, staring directly at my house. He stood there for nearly 10 minutes just watching, and I had the terrifying feeling that he knew I was watching him back. The next morning, Tom knocked on my door with a plate of homemade muffins. "I thought you might enjoy these," he said with his usual smile, but there was something different in his eyes. Something calculating. "That's so thoughtful of you," I replied, accepting the plate with hands that I hoped weren't visibly shaking. "You know, Margaret, I've been thinking about how close we've become over the years," Tom continued, not making any move to leave. "You're like family to me. I hope you know that you can trust me with anything." The emphasis he put on the word, anything, sent chills down my spine. Was he testing me? Did he suspect that I knew something? "Of course, Tom. You've been such a good friend." "Good," he said, his smile widening. "Because I'd hate for anything to come between us. I'd hate for you to get the wrong idea about me or my activities." After he left, I immediately called Detective Rodriguez. "He knows," I told her. "I don't know how, but he knows I'm suspicious." "We need to move faster than we planned," she replied. "Can you get us one more piece of evidence? We need to see inside that garage to confirm what's there." "How am I supposed to do that? He's watching me constantly now." "There's going to be a neighborhood block party this Saturday. We've arranged for some of our undercover officers to attend. While Tom is distracted socializing, we need you to get us access to that garage." The block party was an annual event that I'd helped organize for the past 5 years. It was held in the street in front of our houses, with tables of food and games for the children. Under normal circumstances, it was one of my favorite community events. This year it felt like I was walking into a trap. Tom seemed unusually social at the party, chatting with neighbors he'd barely spoken to in 3 years. I watched him interact with the children who were playing games, and it made me sick to think about what he was really thinking as he smiled at them. "He's good at this," Detective Rodriguez said quietly, appearing beside me disguised as a neighbor from another street. "Predators often are. They know how to blend in, how to seem trustworthy." Around noon, when Tom was engaged in a conversation with several other neighbors, Detective Rodriguez gave me the signal. I walked casually toward Tom's house as if I was just going to use his bathroom, but instead I slipped around to the side door of his garage. Tom had given me a spare key to his house years ago, in case of emergencies. I'd never used it before, but I still had it on my keychain. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the lock. The garage was even worse than what I'd glimpsed through the window. In addition to the photographs on the walls, there were computers with files labeled with children's names, video equipment, and boxes of what looked like children's clothing and toys. But the most horrifying discovery was a detailed map of our neighborhood with certain houses marked in red. Houses where families with young children lived. Tom had been systematically targeting the children in our community. I took as many photos as I could with the camera Detective Rodriguez had given me, my hands shaking so badly I wasn't sure if any of them would be clear. I was just about to leave when I heard footsteps approaching the garage. Tom's voice carried through the door. "I just need to grab something from the garage. I'll be right back." I was trapped. There was no other way out of the garage, and Tom was about to discover me with evidence of his crimes. I looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the garage was too open, too well lit. The door handle turned and Tom stepped inside. When he saw me standing there with the camera in my hands, his friendly mask finally slipped completely. "Well, well," he said, closing the door behind him. "I had a feeling you'd been getting a little too curious about my hobbies." "Tom, I can explain." "No need to explain, Margaret. I know exactly what you're doing here." His voice was cold now, completely different from the warm, caring tone I'd known for 3 years. "The question is, what am I going to do about it?" Tom moved closer, and I realized that this kind, helpful neighbor I'd trusted completely was about to become my worst nightmare. He was alone in a garage full of evidence of his crimes against children, and no one at the block party would think to look for me here. "You've been such a good neighbor, Margaret," Tom continued, his voice taking on a mocking tone. "So trusting, so grateful for all my help. Do you have any idea how easy it would have been for me to hurt you at any time over the past 3 years?" I backed against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. "The police know I'm here, Tom. If something happens to me..." "The police." Tom laughed. a sound that was nothing like the warm chuckles I'd heard from him before. You mean your friend Detective Rodriguez? Yes, I know all about your little investigation. My blood turned to ice. How could he possibly know about Detective Rodriguez? You see, Margaret, I've been doing this for a very long time. I know how to spot surveillance, how to identify undercover officers, how to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Did you really think I wouldn't notice you taking pictures of my visitors? Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. I'm sorry it has to end this way. I really did enjoy having you as a neighbor. But you've seen too much and I can't let you ruin everything I've built here. I closed my eyes, certain that I was about to die in this garage surrounded by evidence of Tom's crimes against children. But instead of the pain I expected, I heard shouting from outside. Police. Search warrant. The garage door exploded inward as a SWAT team burst through, their weapons trained on Tom. He dropped the knife and raised his hands, the predatory confidence draining from his face as he realized his operation had been completely exposed. Margaret, are you okay? Detective Rodriguez appeared at my side as officers handcuffed Tom. I nodded, unable to speak as the reality of how close I'd come to death sank in. We've been monitoring the garage with surveillance equipment for the past week, she explained. We heard everything he said to you. We have him on attempted murder in addition to all the child exploitation charges. As Tom was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at me one last time. You have no idea what you've done, he said. This operation is bigger than just me. They'll come for you. Detective Rodriguez squeezed my shoulder. Don't listen to him. He's just trying to scare you. But as I watched my neighbor of 3 years being driven away in a police car, I realized that my nightmare was far from over. Tom had been part of a larger network, and now that I'd helped expose him, I might have painted a target on my back. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Tom's crimes. He had been part of an international child exploitation ring, using his garage as a production facility for illegal content that was distributed worldwide. The children in the photographs were from our neighborhood and surrounding communities, all of them victimized without their families ever knowing. Tom's real name was Thomas Mitchell, and he had a history of similar crimes in 4 other states. He'd been using false identities to move from community to community, always targeting neighborhoods with young families and always presenting himself as the perfect neighbor. He chose you specifically, Detective Rodriguez explained during one of our follow-up meetings. Single women, especially widows, make ideal neighbors for predators because they're grateful for help and less likely to be suspicious of a man's motives. The revelation that I'd been deliberately targeted made me feel violated in a way I'd never experienced before. Every act of kindness Tom had shown me, every time he'd helped with my house or yard, had been calculated to gain my trust and provide him with cover for his real activities. The other members of Tom's network were arrested over the following months, but the damage to our community was immense. Parents were terrified to let their children play outside. Neighbors who had once trusted each other implicitly now viewed everyone with suspicion. I had to testify at Tom's trial, facing him in court as prosecutors detailed the full extent of his crimes. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, but even that didn't feel like enough justice for what he'd done to so many innocent children. The house next door sat empty for over a year before new neighbors moved in. I found myself unable to trust easily, constantly watching for signs that people weren't who they claimed to be. The experience had taught me that evil could hide behind the most convincing mask of kindness. But it also taught me the importance of trusting my instincts. When something felt wrong, even if I couldn't explain why, I learned to pay attention to that feeling. The small inconsistencies in Tom's story, the secretive behavior, the late-night activities, they had all been warning signs that I'd initially dismissed. I still live in the same house on Maple Street, but I'm no longer the trusting, naive woman I was before. I've installed security cameras, joined a neighborhood watch program, and learned to verify information about people before allowing them into my life. The children in our neighborhood are safe now, but the scars from Tom's presence will last for years. Some families moved away, unable to feel secure in a place where they'd been so thoroughly deceived. Others, like me, stayed but changed, becoming more vigilant, more suspicious, more aware of the darkness that can hide behind a friendly smile. Tom had been right about one thing. I had no idea what I was doing when I started investigating him. I was just a lonely widow who thought she was being paranoid about her helpful neighbor. But sometimes being paranoid is exactly what keeps you and others safe. The most important lesson I learned is that predators count on our politeness, our reluctance to seem suspicious or ungrateful. They use our social conditioning against us, knowing that most people won't question someone who's being helpful and kind. But kindness without boundaries is dangerous. Trust without verification is naive. And sometimes the person who seems too good to be true really is hiding something terrible. I'll never again ignore the voice in my head that says something isn't right, no matter how rude or paranoid it might make me seem. Because the alternative, allowing a predator to continue harming children because I was too polite to investigate my suspicions, is unthinkable. Tom Bradley or Thomas Mitchell or whatever his real name was, taught me that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it brings you cookies, fixes your fence, and earns your trust before revealing its true nature. But he also taught me that ordinary people like me have the power to stop monsters, if we're brave enough to act on our suspicions and strong enough to see the investigation through to the end. The garage next door is empty now, but I'll never forget what was hidden inside it. And I'll never again assume that someone is safe just because they seem kind. What do you think about this terrifying story of deception and courage? Have you ever had suspicions about a neighbor that turned out to be justified? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of ordinary people who uncovered extraordinary secrets. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and remember, sometimes being suspicious might just save lives. Check out our next story about a woman who discovered her best friend had been living a double life that put everyone around her in danger.